Prior to the 19th century, farmers selected seed in order to secure the basis for their next year's crop. The seed was selected for numbers of things, but most importantly for flavor, because flavor has always been the signature of nutrition. And when generations of farmers take a particular crop and shape it to the tastes of their community and to the conditions that they grow in, whether it's wet, whether it's dry, the soil variety that they have, it's called a land race, something that emerges as a kind of expression of an agricultural culture or a people, a community over many generations. With the grains that were so important to settlers, the wheat, the barley, the maize, the rye, the oats. All of these were the building blocks of their culinary cultures that produced the bread, the beer, and the porridges that were essential to eating. Hybridizations become scientific over the course of the 19th century. And after Gregor Mendel's proof of the ways that plants are organized in the 1860s, the experimental stations all across the United States begin programs of selecting the ideal traits and trying to combine them through a kind of pedigree combination, the same thing you do with horses and dogs, but doing it with plants. And celebrities grow up like Luther Burbank, who takes Japanese plums and crosses them with the European damson prunes, or the aromatic American plums to create things like the Santa Rosa, or the large oxheart, or the abundance plums, these plums that became the ideal fruits of the early 20th century. Now, as our knowledge of genetics increased, the degree of manipulation that could take place grew exponentially. And at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of a transgenic manipulation of plants took place, where one could take traits, say cold resistance from an Arctic lichen, and insert it into the genes of a tomato to make a cold-tolerant tomato. This is what we call GMO, the artificial creation of a genetic composite creation. And one of the things that the businesses that did these sorts of genetic manipulations did was, in order to ensure that they held a monopoly on seed, they developed a property right around it, and as extra insurance, they created a mechanism, a genetic mechanism within the seed itself that would shut off the capacity to reproduce, so farmers could not save seed and plant again the next year. They had to go back to the business and buy seed from the seed company. And one of the great problems that arises is when, say, pollen from a GMO plant, say a canola plant, crosses with a non-GMO plant, and something pops up on your property that's a cross between the two, sexually reproduced, that has certain of the patented traits that the GMO plant has been designed for. And that's when the major companies intervene and ensure that those plants are destroyed and that you cannot profit from them. Major seed companies doing GMO crops contract with farmers. You have to sign a fairly substantial agreement indicating that, for instance, that you will not save seed, that you will not attempt to cross the GMO seed with any other seed in order to instill in your subsequent crops certain virtues or attributes that the GMO seed possessed. There have been a number of lawsuits very well publicized over the last 15 years or so, many of them surrounding canola, where you have a situation where one of those traits, like resistance to Roundup is carried over to a reproducing plant due to a cross. A canola plant that had the protection pollinated a canola plant that didn't, and the offspring had the protection, and that's when you have the company that did the design of those GMO traits steps in and sues the farmer. One of the things which large-scale cropping requires is control of weeds, control of pests, control of pathogens, and industrial agriculture depends on chemicals in order to do that. And one of the chemicals that they use is an herbicide called Roundup, which is used to minimize pathogens caused by being carried in plants. It is an herbicide that kills weeds, and so if you have a crop that is resistant to this herbicide, it can grow while all the weeds that might compete for nutriment don't. And all of the things that might somehow communicate diseases to your crop in terms of random plants in the vicinity don't survive. And that's why Roundup resistance became an important dimension of the industrial cropping system in the 21st century. One of the things that happens, of course, is that if someone who is abiding by a contract and is forced to fulfill all of the protocols sees a local farmer trying to get around or violate it, they're going to report, because there's always a potential that that person might profit to your cost. And that's the reason why some of these lawsuits arose in connection with the transmission of patented traits to crops that were offspring of GMO and pedigree cultivars. I've said that taste is the signature of nutrition for human beings and all other biological creatures as well. Creatures in the wild determine what they eat by the taste. And on farms, over generations, there's always been a search for good taste. But in the 19th century, strange things happened. And I'll give an example in terms of the watermelon. There was a watermelon created in the antebellum period. It was called the Bradford watermelon. It was the finest tasting, most splendid melon known in the early 19th century. It was grown in the South, here in South Carolina, in the 1850s. The Civil War comes, and of course it destroys the plantations which are the basis of the economy. And after the war, the South determined that it had to bootstrap itself back into economic viability by selling its vegetables and fruits to the North. One of the things that they shipped up to New York was this watermelon. And people tasted the Bradford and they said, this is splendid. And it stimulates an enormous desire for this melon. But there's a problem. This melon does not stack well in a railroad boxcar. It will crush. And you will lose 60% of your watermelons when shipping them north. So what does a southern farmer do? They say, we have to create a watermelon that has the hide of a rhinoceros. So they crossed this Bradford watermelon and another watermelon called a rattlesnake, which is also good tasting, with a scaly bark watermelon that has a tough hide. And they create a Kolb's Gem watermelon that can withstand being shipped north. It can be stacked 5 deep in a boxcar. Now people are making lots of money off this melon. And what you do is, when you're making lots of money, you plant more of the thing. So entire counties get planted with the Kolb's Gem watermelon in South Carolina and Georgia. Now what happens when you cover an entire landscape with one crop is that the bug or the disease that has a particular taste for that crop will eventually find it. In 1893, a disease called Fusarium wilt popped up in Georgia and started wiping out these watermelons county by county over one growing season.
Say that. Over
Over one growing season. So, the farmers are losing their livelihood. Plant breeders create a plant that is resistant to fusarium wilt. And so the plant breeders go in and start crossing them with all sorts of watermelons, including one from West Africa called the Congo, which provides this resistance. But what you see is that in terms of desirable traits, first is now disease resistance. Second is now transportability, and taste keeps getting shunted lower and lower on the scale of things. The more that the industrial farming system took hold and market considerations determined how a watermelon or any other plant was shaped, the more that eye appeal, shelf life, transportability, disease resistance, processability takes precedence over the thing that should be foremost in our concern, the taste. The question of how you source heirloom seed, particularly if you want to farm and scale, is an interesting one, because a lot of the material that floats around the seed exchanges, the stuff that has been preserved, there's not that great a quantity to it. But there are certain types of seed that are generally available in large quantity. For instance, hickory king corn, a splendid white dent corn. The seed is available on several continents because of its virtues, its versatility. Foundations exist, such as the one that I head, Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, whose mission it is to supply seed to farmers wishing to grow heirloom grain crops organically in the Southeast. Why must these be grown organically? Well, a lot of these land races and early hybrid grain varieties were originally bred with low fertilizer inputs and low amounts of water. They're highly drought resistant and don't require a lot of input. So if you use a modern industrial fertilizing scheme on them, what they'll do is shoot up 15 feet tall and blow down in the first wind and lodge. They'll convert all of that petroleum fertilizer energy into foliage instead of fruit. They behave in very bizarre patterns. So if you're growing an heirloom or landrace grain or vegetable, it's best to grow them under an older scheme of cultivation than a modern industrial scheme.
When you say younger, older scheme?
In the 19th century, guano, the bird droppings from the islands off Peru, were the fertilizer of choice, and they were often mixed with calcareous manures, manures that had a high degree of limestone in them. And the manuring systems often depended on crop rotations and intercropping, growing squash and beans with grain, or growing bene with corn. And the chemical interactions of the crops in the soil would create reactions which benefited both crops that you were growing. And sometimes all 3 or 4 grains you're growing simultaneously in the field would be harvested at one time and incorporated into a bread. Or sometimes you segregated the seed out. Those are some of the older schemes of cultivation. In monocropping, you just have one crop in the field. You ensure that there are no other crops by chemical means, and you use a mechanized means to process, to harvest and process the crop, often in the field itself. Monocropping invites disease, it invites pestilence. The more you concentrate and don't allow diversity on a landscape, the more that thing which feeds or predates on what you're growing was going to congregate there. It's just a behavior of nature. And so the dispersion of crops over landscapes with boundaries or barriers in between them is much more healthy than having, as I say, an entire center section of Georgia just growing watermelons or peaches. Because once the danger shows up, the predator shows up, the disease shows up, it's clear sailing all the way to where it stops growing. There was a period, for instance, in the early 20th century when seed businesses had a very strong local service capacity to them. And one of the problems that's arisen over the course of the 20th century has been the concentration, the purchase of these smaller regional seed companies by a handful, 6 major corporations that are international, and the shutting off of the resources of those local companies. And I'll give an example. The greatest seed company that ever existed in South Carolina was Coker Seed in Hartsville, South Carolina. David Coker was a visionary plant breeder who created many important cultivars in cotton, in wheat strains, which were designed to do well in the hot South Carolina countryside, in soybeans, and half a dozen other crops. In 1978, the German company Kleinwansleben Staatsuk, now called KWS, purchased them and took all their seed resources. Now, this is a company that's based in Germany, whose business is international and is concerned with Europe, South America, and Asia. So all of these cultivars that were designed, for instance, the wheats, for growing in the southeastern circumstance, have now been mothballed because that's not the direction which KWS wishes to go. And so an extraordinary resource has been lost, has been privatized, and has been put away. We have no access to that. And this happens time and time again. And as the 6 big companies buy up more, even conventional seed companies, these conventional seed companies often have equivalent products. So what happens is that 5 versions of a pea is shut down in order to feature the one that the major umbrella company wishes to emphasize. Diversity disappears. The world of growing became a community in the 1820s in America, and it became because of a crisis. In the 18th century, people just planted the same crops on the same lands time and time again, and of course the soil became exhausted, and you had a decline in productivity. In the face of this crisis, with your son heading out to the Western Territories rather than staying on your farm, people decided that they had to cease being an imitation farmer of your father's ways and look to scientific agriculture and form communities where you traded the best sorts of information about the best sorts of crops, how to use rotations, how to engage in manuring. And what you had was the creation of an agricultural world, a world where seed disciplines were maintained by agricultural societies, where all the farmers gathered at least once every year in order to exhibit the best of their products, to determine who would be the seedsman for a given crop for the subsequent years, because everyone wanted the seed of the best grower. And by this way, you had an entire community involved in the improvement of crops. And you also had literature, the rise of agricultural journals. Reading became a necessity for farmers beginning in 1819, when the American Agriculturist becomes the first farm magazine that everyone read. Nowadays, there's many ways, from YouTube videos to Modern Farmer to other sources on the internet, to get your information, USDA bulletins. But one of the things that's been lost is the face-to-face community of farming. The 4-H clubs tried to maintain it for the longest period of time, but under the industrial farming scheme, it's usually the farmer and the corporation, which is the essential community. Often the research agendas of science are determined by the agronomic imperatives laid down by certain business corporations these days. They're looking for certain harvestables or marketables in a plant, and that approach sometimes loses the circumspection of the old wisdom about farming. There was a kind of farming once that was soil-centered, that the health of the soil, the tilth, was the heart of everything, and manuring, ensuring that I come from a part of the country that is blessed with abundant water that usually is dispersed across the growing season in a way that enables crop after crop to make. But as anyone who looks at the national scene in farming is aware, there are parts of the nation that are suffering from water shortages or periodic floods, depending on the way that the currents in the Pacific Ocean are running. We have the vegetable system in the United States largely centered in California. And what is happening now with the drought there is causing a great deal of concern. Where are farmers going to go if they don't have the water to grow vegetables? Will they be coming back here where vegetables were once grown in abundance? There are all sorts of questions involved. And there are choices to be made. Certain vegetables are thirstier. Certain plants are thirstier. Corn is a very thirsty plant. And it's sucking up aquifers everywhere. So is it wiser to plant sorghum, which is a less thirsty, more drought-tolerant plant? Well, those sorts of decisions are being made everywhere. And it's something which is just part of the necessitous life that farmers lead. We're forced to make very hard decisions sometimes. And climate, water, changes in temperature, all of those are pressures that are inescapable.